the night Dean Martin asked Johnny Carson the question that changed everything. There are moments in television history that millions witnessed, yet no one truly saw. This is the story of one such night, a Thursday in February 1974, when Johnny Carson and Dean Martin shared a stage, a bottle of scotch, and a silence that would never be spoken about again. The studio audience at NBC's Burbank lot had no idea. Neither did the 15 million people watching from home. They saw what they always saw: Dean Martin, loose and charming, cracking jokes about his drinking. Johnny Carson, the master of timing, playing the straight man who knew exactly when to let the laugh breathe. The applause signs lit up. The band swung into a familiar rhythm. Everything looked like it always did, but it wasn't. 17 minutes before air, Johnny Carson stood in his dressing room, tie loosened, staring at the rundown sheet. Dean Martin's name sat at the top of the guest list, circled twice in red marker by Fred de Cordova, the show's producer. Beside it, a handwritten note: "Keep it light, 8 minutes max." Carson had worked with Dean for over a decade. They'd done sketches, roasts, charity events. Dean was reliable television, funny without trying, beloved without effort. But in the past 6 months, something had shifted. The calls from Dean's manager had become more frequent, the requests more specific. Make sure there's a glass on the desk. Don't ask about the divorce. Keep the questions easy. Johnny folded the rundown and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He didn't need it. He'd memorized every beat, every pivot point, every place where he could bail Dean out if things went sideways. That was the job. That was what 12 years of hosting The Tonight Show had taught him. Protect the guest, protect the show, protect the illusion. He checked his watch. 16 minutes. Down the hall, in the guest green room, Dean Martin sat alone with a tumbler of scotch. Not the prop scotch, the kind that looked like whiskey but tasted like weak tea. Real scotch, Johnny Walker Blue. The bottle sat on the coffee table, a quarter gone, though Dean had only been in the room for 20 minutes. A production assistant knocked once, then opened the door. "Mr. Martin, we're at 15 minutes. Would you like to head to makeup?" Dean didn't look up. "I'm good, sweetheart." "They just want to do a quick powder." "I said I'm good." The PA hesitated, then left. Dean poured another 2 fingers and leaned back into the couch. His hands were steady. They were always steady. That's what people didn't understand. Dean Martin wasn't a drunk. He was a man who drank, and there was a difference. A drunk couldn't hit his marks. A drunk couldn't land a punchline 3 beats after setup. A drunk couldn't make 15 movies in 8 years. But tonight, the steadiness felt like effort. The walk to stage. At 11 minutes before air, Fred de Cordova appeared at Johnny's dressing room door. He didn't knock. He never knocked. "Dean's still in the green room," Fred said. Johnny looked at him in the mirror. And he's into the scotch." "How far into it?" Fred paused. "Far enough that I'm telling you." Johnny's face didn't change. He adjusted his cufflinks, smoothed his jacket, and stood. "Is he sloppy?" "No, but he's not Dean Martin sober either." Johnny walked past Fred into the hallway. "Then we do what we always do. We make it look easy." Fred followed. "Johnny, if this goes sideways, it won't." "But if it does..." Johnny stopped and turned. The hallway lighting cast sharp shadows across his face. "Fred, I've been doing this show for 12 years. I've had guests show up drunk, high, angry, heartbroken, and completely unprepared. Dean Martin on a bad night is still better than most people on their best. We'll be fine." Fred nodded, but he didn't look convinced. At 7 minutes before air, a stage manager escorted Dean from the green room to the backstage holding area. Dean moved with the same easy grace he always had, shoulders relaxed, smile ready, eyes half-lidded in that trademark expression that made him look perpetually amused by a private joke. But Johnny, standing in the wings going over his monologue cards, caught something in Dean's gait, a fractional hesitation before each step. The kind of thing a camera wouldn't catch, but a friend would. Dean saw Johnny and raised his glass in a mock toast. "Here's to another night of show business, Pally." Johnny smiled. "You bring your own prop tonight?" "Always do. Keeps it authentic." They stood 6 feet apart, separated by cables and crew members doing final checks. The stage manager counted down from 3 minutes. The band ran through the opening sting. Doc Severinsen adjusted his trumpet. Everything moved with the mechanical precision of a show that had been performed over 2,000 times. Dean took another sip. Johnny pretended not to notice. The first 8 minutes. The show opened the way it always did. Johnny's monologue landed. The audience laughed in the right places. Ed McMahon fed him the setups. Tommy Newsom conducted the band through the commercial break stinger. And then, after the second break, Johnny said the words that had introduced 1,000 guests. My next guest needs no introduction, but I'll give him one anyway. Dean Martin walked onto the stage to thunderous applause. He waved, blew a kiss to a woman in the front row, and settled into the guest chair with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this 100 times. Because he had. Johnny leaned forward. Dean, good to see you. Good to be seen, John. The audience laughed. It was the kind of nothing line that Dean could make sound like the funniest thing in the world. Johnny smiled, waiting for the laughter to crest, then said, You look good? You been on vacation? I've been on vacation from work, if that's what you mean. Another laugh. Johnny glanced at his cards. 3 questions prepped, all soft, all easy. He didn't need them. He knew how this went. He'd start with the movies, move to the music, let Dean tell the Sinatra story everyone had heard before, and close with a plug for whatever project Dean was promoting. 8 minutes, maybe 9 if it was going well. But then Dean said something that wasn't on the cards. You ever get tired of this, Johnny? The question landed in the space between the laughter fading and the next line beginning. Johnny's smile didn't falter, but something shifted in his eyes. Tired of what? This. Dean gestured vaguely at the stage, the cameras, the audience, the whole song and dance. The audience laughed, assuming it was part of the bit. Johnny played along. Well, it beats working for a living. Does it? There was no edge in Dean's voice, no bitterness, just curiosity. But Johnny felt it, the thing he'd been sensing all night, now surfacing. He pivoted. You're in a philosophical mood tonight. I'm in a Scotch mood. Dean raised his glass. The audience laughed again, louder this time. It was the Dean Martin they expected, the lovable lush, the guy who made drinking look like a lifestyle choice instead of a problem. But Johnny saw Dean's hand around the glass, saw the way his thumb pressed against the crystal, saw the tiny muscle tension in his jaw. He asked about the new album. Dean answered. He asked about the Vegas shows. Dean told a story. The 8 minutes passed the way they were supposed to. The band played them out. Dean stood, shook Johnny's hand, and walked off stage to more applause. And then they cut to commercial. 4 minutes in the dark. The moment the red light on camera 1 went dark, Johnny's posture changed. Not dramatically. He didn't slump, or exhale, or do anything the audience would notice as the stage manager counted down the commercial break. But his shoulders dropped half an inch. His smile reset to neutral. He glanced toward the wings where Dean had exited. Fred de Cordova appeared at the edge of the stage, clipboard in hand. That was good, clean. Johnny didn't respond. He was still looking toward the wings. Johnny? Is Dean still backstage? I think so. Why? Johnny stood, adjusted his jacket, and walked off stage without answering. Fred started to follow, then thought better of it. Some conversations weren't meant for producers. Backstage, beyond the reach of the studio lights, Dean Martin stood in the narrow hallway that connected the stage to the dressing rooms. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, glass in hand, staring at nothing in particular. Johnny approached from the side. You okay? Dean turned. His smile returned instantly. Sure, Pally, why wouldn't I be? You were different out there. Different how? You know how. Dean took a sip of scotch. I'm always the same, Johnny. That's the bit. They stood in the dim hallway, surrounded by the muffled sounds of the show continuing without them. Somewhere nearby, a stagehand wheeled a set piece past. A phone rang in a distant office. The band played through another commercial break. Johnny lowered his voice. How much are you drinking? Same as always. Dean, what do you want me to say? Dean's voice didn't rise. It stayed exactly where it always was, smooth, controlled, untouchable. You want me to tell you I'm falling apart? You want me to cry on your shoulder and say it's all getting to be too much? He finished the scotch in one swallow. I'm Dean Martin, Johnny. I don't fall apart. That's not the character. This isn't about the character. Everything's about the character. Dean set the empty glass on a nearby equipment case. You of all people should know that. Johnny opened his mouth to respond, but Dean kept going. You think I don't know what people say? Dean Martin, he's washed up. Dean Martin, he's drunk. Dean Martin, he's coasting on the old act. And you know what? They're right. I am coasting. Because coasting is all I've got left. The hallway felt smaller now, quieter. Johnny could hear his own breathing. Dean's face hadn't changed. He wasn't angry. He wasn't sad. He was just tired. And for the first time in all the years Johnny had known him, the mask wasn't quite in place. "I'm 56 years old," Dean said. "I've been doing this since I was 17. That's 39 years of playing Dean Martin. And some days, Johnny, I can't remember who I was before I started." Johnny didn't know what to say. In 12 years of hosting The Tonight Show, he'd interviewed presidents, astronauts, actors, musicians, writers, and every other kind of person the world could produce. He'd learned how to navigate any conversation, how to find the angle, how to make people comfortable. But this wasn't an interview. This was something else. "You ever think about stopping?" Dean asked. "Sometimes." "What stops you?" Johnny thought about it. "I don't know what I'd do instead." Dean nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's the trap, isn't it?" A stage manager appeared at the end of the hallway. "Mr. Carson, we're back from commercial in 90 seconds. Johnny raised a hand in acknowledgement, but didn't move. He looked at Dean. "You want to come back out? Do another segment?" Dean smiled. It was the Dean Martin smile, the one that had sold 1 million records and filled 1,000 theaters. "Nah, I said what I needed to say." "Did you?" Dean picked up his empty glass. "Close enough." They stood there for 5 more seconds. Johnny wanted to say something meaningful, something that would cut through the layers of performance and reach whatever was left underneath. But he couldn't find the words, and maybe there weren't any. "Take care of yourself, Dean. You too, Pally." Johnny walked back toward the stage. Behind him, he heard Dean's footsteps moving in the opposite direction, toward the dressing rooms, toward the bottle that was still 3/4 full, toward whatever came next. The rest of the show, Johnny returned to his desk with 30 seconds to spare. The stage manager counted down. The red light on camera 1 came back on. Johnny smiled at the audience and introduced the next guest, a comedian whose name would be forgotten by morning. The show continued. The rhythm returned. Everything went back to normal. But Johnny's timing was off for the rest of the night. Not enough that the audience would notice. Not enough that it would make the highlight reel of mistakes and bloopers. Just enough that he could feel it. A half-second late on a laugh cue. A question that should have been follow-up but wasn't. A moment where his mind was somewhere else. Ed McMahon, sitting to his right, noticed. Doc Severinsen noticed. Fred DeCorva, watching from the wings, noticed. But none of them said anything. That was the unspoken rule. The show goes on. At the end of the hour, Johnny did his golf swing. The band played the closing theme. The credits rolled. And 17 million people watching at home turned off their televisions thinking they'd watch Johnny Carson and Dean Martin do what they always did. What happened after? Johnny Carson never mentioned that conversation. Not in interviews, not in his autobiography, not even to Ed McMahon, who'd been his friend and sidekick for 30 years. It was as if those 4 minutes in the hallway had never happened. Dean Martin appeared on The Tonight Show 14 more times over the next 20 years. Every appearance was exactly what it was supposed to be. Dean drinking, Dean joking, Dean playing the character he'd perfected decades ago. Johnny never asked him about that night. Dean never brought it up. But something changed. People who worked on the show, writers, producers, crew members, noticed that Johnny treated differently after February 1974. Not obviously, not in a way that would show up on camera, but in small moments. The way Johnny would let Dean's segments run a minute or 2 longer than scheduled. The way he'd steer questions away from anything too personal. The way he'd watch Dean from the wings before the cameras came on, checking, making sure. Fred DeCordova once asked Johnny about it, years later, after both men had retired. "You remember that night with Dean, February 74? Johnny had looked at him for a long moment. Then he'd said, "Which night?" And that was the end of the conversation. The last appearance, Dean Martin's final appearance on The Tonight Show, was in December 1988, 6 years before Johnny retired. By then, Dean was 71 years old. His son, Dean Paul Martin, had died in a plane crash earlier that year. Dean had stopped performing, stopped recording, stopped doing much of anything. But he came on the show one more time. Johnny didn't ask about the drinking. He didn't ask about the death of Dean's son. He didn't ask about the years of playing a character that had long since consumed the man underneath. They talked about golf. They talked about old friends. They told stories everyone had heard before. And when the segment ended, Dean stood, shook Johnny's hand, and said, "Thanks for everything, Pally." Johnny held the handshake a beat longer than usual. "You too." Dean walked off stage. The audience applauded. The band played. And Johnny watched him go with an expression that millions of people saw, but no one could quite read. Dean Martin died 7 years later, on Christmas Day, 1995. Johnny Carson was retired by then, living in Malibu, making no public appearances. He didn't attend the funeral. He didn't release a statement. He didn't do any of the things that famous people do when other famous people die. But a few people close to Johnny said that he'd been different in the days after Dean's death. Quieter, more distant, as if he were thinking about something he couldn't quite put into words. What the camera never showed, television is a business of illusions. The perfect lighting that hides every wrinkle, the careful editing that removes every mistake, the laugh track that covers every silence. And for 30 years, Johnny Carson and Dean Martin were masters of the illusion. But that night in February 1974, for 4 minutes in a backstage hallway, the illusion cracked. Not broke, never broke. Just cracked enough that two men who had spent their entire lives performing could be honest with each other about the cost. "You ever get tired of this?" It was the only real question Dean Martin asked that night. And Johnny Carson, who'd answered thousands of questions over thousands of hours of television, never actually answered it. Because some questions don't have answers. They just have silence. And sometimes, silence is the only honest response. The archive, there's a tape of that episode somewhere in the NBC archive. If you watched it today, you'd see exactly what 15 million people saw in 1974. Johnny Carson and Dean Martin, two professionals at the top of their game, making it look easy. You wouldn't see the scotch that wasn't a prop. You wouldn't see the hesitation in Dean's walk. You wouldn't see the moment Johnny's smile reset to neutral when the camera cut away. And you definitely wouldn't see the 4 minutes in the hallway, because the camera wasn't there. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the most important moments in television history are the ones that never made it to air. The ones that happened in the spaces between segments, between jokes, between the performance and the person underneath. Johnny Carson understood that better than anyone. He spent 30 years perfecting the space between, the pause before the punchline, the beat after the laugh, the moment when the audience leans forward because they sense something is about to happen. But that night, in a hallway backstage at The Tonight Show, the space between wasn't about comedy. It was about two men, both trapped in characters they'd spent decades building, recognizing each other in the only way they knew how, with a question that had no answer, and a goodbye that was never said. Epilogue, the unspoken code. Years later, after Johnny Carson had retired and Dean Martin had passed away, a young comedian asked Ed McMahon what it was like to work with both of them. Ed thought about it for a moment, then said, "They were professionals, the best kind, the kind who never let you see them sweat." "Did you ever see them break character?" Ed smiled, "Once or twice, but those weren't my stories to tell." The comedian pressed, "What do you mean?" Ed stood to leave, then paused at the door. "In this business, you learn pretty quick that there's the show everyone watches, and then there's the show behind the show. The second one is harder. It costs more. And if you're good at it, really good, no one ever knows it's happening." Were Johnny and Dean good at it? Ed looked back one more time. The best. And with that, he walked out, leaving the question hanging in the air, the same way it had hung in that hallway in February 1974, unanswered, but understood.